might be in the wrong room, this panel is called Media Policies for a Democratic Future, an all-party panel. Somewhat of a misnomer, because as you might notice, at the front here, there is a party missing, and that would be the Conservative Party. They were invited, but chose not to send a representative. So we are having an all-party invited panel with 3 MPs here. Very grateful to have your time today. We have with us Libby Davies from the NDP, Elizabeth May from the Green Party, and apologies in advance from Elizabeth, who has to get back to her constituency this afternoon. She'll be leaving us at 3:30, and HEDY FRY from the Liberal Party. Thank you all for joining us today. So just before I outline the format for our discussion today, I did want to acknowledge that we are on unceded Coast Salish territory, the Musqueam, the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and to thank them, to acknowledge that we're on their territory, but personally to thank them for the efforts that they put into finding peaceful and incredible patience in reconciling their title and rights to this territory. I personally have had the opportunity to work with all 3 nations in a number of different capacities, and really find that our way forward into the future is so importantly linked to that past and understanding the territory that we're on here today. So with that, I am going to give you a brief overview of the format for today. I have asked all the candidates to tell you a story to start off with, and I will tell you what they'll tell you what the story is about for them, but I will give you the question in a minute. We're going to start with that, and then hoping to sort of expand into a bit of a dialogue with some discussion about media, media policies, and how they relate to the democratization of media, and also social media included in that topic. Then we're also going to have some questions from the floor. So if you have questions, good to jot them down. We should be getting to that session just before 3:30. So if you have questions for Elizabeth May, those should be the first ones up, and I will call you up at that time. So we're going to start with Elizabeth May on the first question. And the question I asked them to answer was to tell us, all of us collectively, the story of the first time you became aware of how much the media can influence public debate on public policy. I think we all have that moment, that aha moment when we realize how much impact media has on these public discussions that we're having. So Elizabeth, you're ready to go.
I'm going to start with a story that goes way back, and again, I want to repeat the apology Andrea extended on my behalf that I have to leave. I came from a politically aware, politically active family. I grew up in the U.S., so my aha moment was when I was 13. I was a big fan of Mike Wallace of CBS News at the time, CBS, right? And I was in December 1967 with my mom. We took the train from Connecticut to Chicago for a gathering of dissenting and concerned Democrats wanting to get rid of LBJ as the nominee so that we could have a peace candidate to oppose the war in Vietnam. We were over the moon that a senator we'd admired for a great long time, Senator Eugene McCarthy of Minnesota, was putting his name forward and being nominated at that event. It was an unofficial event, of course. The real convention happened later in Chicago in August of '68. So this is December '67, and Mike Wallace's crew comes up to us, and we're all excited. Look, ladies, you look really great. You're all wearing red, white, blue. You look really cute, you know, and that little girl there, that's good too. We're going to use you for a backdrop. Don't pay any attention to what Mike Wallace is saying. Just stand there and cheer and wave and look happy with your signs and your balloons. Pay no attention to what he's saying. Okay. Well, you're going to be on the evening news. You're going to be on the news. So we're excited. We're standing there, we're cheering. And Mike Wallace stands there, and his stand-up is, well, the delegates here came hoping their nominee would be Bobby Kennedy. It's not. It's Eugene McCarthy. He's gray. He's dull. He's not great. What? Wait, that's not what we said. We think he's great. Cut. We watched him go back further in the room. Same thing. We watched people looking, oh, yeah, okay. Then he starts talking, and the same thing happened. That night, we turned on the news. Mike Wallace was sitting in an empty room, surrounded by empty chairs and stale balloons and placards lying on the floor, and he said, the delegates here were hoping it would be Bobby Kennedy, but it's not. It's Eugene McCarthy. He's dry, he's dull, they're all disappointed, and I'm surrounded by empty chairs, so no one can tell you the truth. I was so angry, and media bias has bothered me ever since. And I didn't mind so much when he got punched at the convention, sorry.
All right, the coming of age story. Thank you. HEDY to hear your first time realizing how media can impact on public policy debates.
Well, I don't have as dramatic a story as Elizabeth, because a lot of my dealings with the media before I went into politics was as a physician and a spokesperson for the doctors, and everything I said was dutifully and factually related in the media, and I thought the media were great, and they gave the facts as they were, and statistical data was all there. And so it was only when I got into politics that I suddenly saw, and it was slow to watch, time after time after time. Now, you know that there are people who write columns, they're columnists, they're opinion makers, editorialists, opinion makers. They put their opinion on the page. But you expect that a reporter who is reporting an incident will be factual and clear, and let the audience, the people who are reading or watching, make their own decisions. But I have found that over the years, reporters have become editorialists and columnists. Everyone instills their own particular personal perspective on the story they're telling, so that the news is always, to some extent, manipulated. But I'm going to give you one story that really struck me very, very clearly, and most of you know the story. In 2001, it was a day to eliminate racism, the 21st of March, and I was the Minister for Multiculturalism, and there was a question from one of my colleagues. As you well know, sometimes, you plant a question from one of your friends because you want to be able to answer it. And it was the question was basically, why do you believe that we should continue to celebrate this day? It was about the Sharpeville massacre. South Africa is now free and democratic. There's no need for this anymore. That whole thing has gone by. And so I said, well, no, actually, there's a reason that, especially in a place like Canada, where we take for granted our freedoms and our multiculturalism and our integration and our diversity, that we got to keep an eye out, because things can slip by us because we all believe in our own philosophy and mantra so much that we're not looking for stuff. And I said, because as we speak, crosses are burning in Prince George. Now, I had just been running, and it was a very busy day for me. We had had a whole bunch of people that were Olympians, were putting their hands out, saying, mettons fin au racisme, end racism, and all that kind of thing. So I had been doing all that. I ran in. This very new communications staffer, who had just come in a week ago, had been desperately reading all the past notes from the bureaucracy informing me, because the RCMP used to inform me monthly about hate crimes and what's going on as part of my job. And so he was reading all this, and he didn't know Prince George for Pustupe. And he went, don't forget Prince George, where they were burning crosses. And I remembered seeing burning crosses, and we had all been shocked at that about a year ago. And I thought, yeah. And I ran in and I said it, and I came out and walked off and did all my other things, and suddenly the media was scrumming me and saying, what is this? The guy from Evie from Prince George says you're lying there on burning crosses. And he was absolutely right. It was the wrong town, but this guy had told me Prince George because he got mixed up with all the towns. But it was stuff that had been going on. That story got placed in the newspaper because they heard what I said, and of course, I was a minister. Everyone said, don't talk to the media, so I stupidly didn't talk to the media, which made the media cheese off at me no end. We shouldn't get my story out, which was that it was true. But what was the most interesting thing about media that bothered me was that 2 weeks later, the RCMP, who couldn't comment because they were actually stalking and doing some intel on a fellow in a part of British Columbia who had been responsible, was a Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. They couldn't say that they were doing this. Anyway, 2 weeks later, there it was, in the Kamloops Daily, that the RCM picked this guy up. He had admitted that it was being done. There were these white caps and white hats and capes and stuff, and he gave the story that this was going on in this part. And it was all about Aboriginal people looking at treaty negotiations, and that was that. What was interesting about it is that the Kamloops Daily put it in, and the province newspaper said, 2 thumbs up to HEDY FRY. She may not have aced geography, but she certainly had a deep throat who told her what was really going on, and here is the story, etc. Not a single other piece of media who had every day really vilified me, called me a liar, called me every name, not one of them picked up the story, although it was there. I mean, in these days you can pick up anything you want out there as they posted. They didn't. They continued for the next 2 years to call me a liar. And that really bothered me, and so I saw that media can tell the truth, can spin the facts, can pretend not to know the truth. And it was only a friend of mine who said, you know what, this is bothering you so much because my life had been based on credibility as a physician, knowing my stuff, etc. And here I was being called a liar. And what was interesting is that I then collected the clippings from the province and from the Panelists daily. And every time somebody, and this took 2 years before I had the guts to do it, anytime a newspaper called me something, I sent them the 2 clippings and I said, and there was a big story in the National Post about the guy getting 2 years and getting 1 year off free because he'd seen the light and he didn't hate anybody anymore and blah, blah, blah. And he spilled the beans. But I sent it to them and I said, I know you don't have enough money for research because all of you are getting cut back. Here's a story. They stopped writing about it. Not one of them apologized, but they just stopped saying it because now that they have the data, they knew that if I choose to, I could have sued them for not telling the truth. But there was, for me, a moment, it wasn't an aha, it was an oh my God moment, that I really learned that the media are powerful influencers and that they, if they wish to influence in a particular way, can become blind and deaf and spin any way they want it.
Thank you, Hedy. Libby.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Andrea. And first of all, thanks so much for moderating when you're in the middle of a crazy civic election. So that's great you're here. I remember the day very well in the House, Hedy, when you stood up and gave that answer. And maybe we'll get into this later, but the response, I think, has a lot to do with sexism in the media and gender bias, and hopefully we'll get to talk about that. I've got a couple of examples. I'm going to date myself too. We all go kind of way back, which is good. We've got lots of experience. But I first understood the power of the media and how they could influence public opinion, public debate, which way a story went. Back in the 70s when I was a young organizer in the Downtown Eastside. And in those days, I think there was a lot more clout of local media. Like you actually could make a really good connection with local news stations. Everything wasn't fed from whatever central news wire. And so as a young activist working with DERA, we learned really, really fast how to use the media to our advantage. And I don't think that the issues that we were working on, literally life and death issues around fire safety, housing safety, fighting slum landlords, fighting City Hall for that matter, would have generated nearly the attention that we got and nearly the change in public attitude about a neighborhood that previously had been called Skid Row and was now a community. If we hadn't been able to relate to the media, figure out what stories they were interested in, and learn how to use that in a very powerful, positive way. So that was a very good experience. A second one I'd give is more recently, the whole drug issue in the Downtown Eastside. One outlet in particular, the Vancouver-Centre, actually dealt with that issue in a very empowering, educational, open debate kind of way. And I learned later that one of the editors at the Sun had a family member who had dealt with drug issues, and so they had a personal connection to the issue. And so their contribution to what was a huge issue was actually quite positive. On the negative side, a couple of examples. Still today, I feel like I have a personal, ongoing battle with the Globe and Mail about how they portray the Downtown Eastside. I feel sick every time I read one of their stories where they dramatize, they demonize, they talk about, you know, the seamy Downtown Eastside, the drug-infested. You'd think everybody who lived in the neighborhood was a drug addict. And I can't tell you how many letters to the editor I've written to the Globe, none of which have ever been printed, taking issue with how they portrayed this very vital and energetic and important neighborhood. So to me that was a negative. They've got some kind of bias, and it's more about they just want to be so bloody dramatic and they just want to make it look so awful, maybe to sell papers, I don't know. The other negative I would say was sort of more, again in BC, I remember the days, you know, of the Glenn Clark fast ferries and, you know, some budget overruns, and the media here were merciless, not only to him personally, in terms of, you remember him building his deck and all of that for those of you around, but they were merciless in their attacks on Glenn Clark, and yet when it came to Gordon Campbell, and what he did, and all of the overruns and the budget stuff, and I mean, it's like the list is so long, we couldn't even put it on the wall here. And I felt the media biases in that, and how they tried to influence public debate and public opinion was just really quite appalling. And that's a more recent example. So it is something that you really have to be aware of. It's sort of a double-edged sword, and sometimes you can make there can be a good influence, and so I don't want to say it's all negative, but I do feel it's harder and harder to do because it is so now controlled and centralized, which is